I know I can't be the only one who's annoyed by the fact that all of these respect the lore and honor our European heritage types consistently mispronounce the name of the actress who's playing Galadriel in Rings of Power. It's Morfydd Clark, not Morfydd. Morfydd. She's Welsh. Respect her heritage. Hey, well met travelers. I am Bob of the Old Ways. Welcome to my channel. I feel like I should start this video off with a caveat and let you know that I'm not some uncritical super fan of the Rings of Power show that's coming out in September. I haven't seen it yet, so I don't know if I like it. But I do have reservations about it. And that's important for you to know going forward, because my reservations have nothing at all to do with the three criticisms I'm going to talk about in this video. And I wanted to put it out there because a lot of people might be coming into this video thinking, oh no, here's another woke super fan who doesn't know anything about the lore and blah, blah, blah. And that's not what's going on here. So very briefly, here's my reservation about the show. It boils down to the fact that I don't think the time period in which the show is being set is interesting enough to sustain a 5-season show. Even if Amazon had the rights to adapt the Silmarillion and the unfinished tales and the other Tolkien sources about the history of Middle-earth, that would still be true. In my opinion, that stuff is interesting, especially for a Tolkien superfan, but it would make bad television. Now, it could be irrelevant. The show could be awesome. We don't know. However, there's another type of fan out there who, let's just say, has already made up their mind. And the criteria on which they've made up their mind can be broken down into 3 broad criticisms of the show, even though it hasn't happened yet. Now, the criticisms I'm going to talk about have led these fans, or maybe I should call them anti-fans, but it's led them to think that the show is garbage without having seen it. Now, they could be right. The show could be a trash fire. Who knows? I mean, look at Game of Thrones. It was awesome for the first 4 seasons or so. Awesome for the first 4 seasons or so. Why do I keep saying show? Game of Thrones was awesome for the first 4 seasons or so, and then it got worse and worse as it went on. But the problems with Game of Thrones had nothing to do with the fact that it changed and omitted huge amounts of lore from the books. So, again, keep that in mind as we go forward. The type of fan you see on the screen next to me and those who sound like them have 3 broad criticisms of the Rings of Power that are never going to be valid under any circumstances. Even if the show is garbage, it will not be garbage because of these 3 reasons. So let's talk about them as briefly as I can without a script. Reason number 1. True fans hate it. This one's pretty easy to deal with. There's no such thing as a true fan of any franchise. Or perhaps a better way to say that is that there's no such thing as a fake fan. Unless the fan is a character. That, unless you are an actor who was hired to play the role of a Tolkien fan on like a commercial or a TV show or something, that's a fake fan. Outside of that, no one is a fake fan. Any person who likes any aspect of The Lord of the Rings for any reason is a true fan. Maybe you like the books and not the Peter Jackson movies. Maybe you've only seen the Peter Jackson movies and you haven't yet read the books. Maybe you only like one of the movies. Maybe you only like Tolkien's poetry from the books. Maybe you just like looking at pretty pictures of the pretty people from the movies, and you have the hots for Aragorn or Orlando Bloom as Legolas or whatever. All of these people are true fans. And I think it's kind of mean and kind of being a bully to write them off, because they're bringing enthusiasm to a franchise that we love, which means the love of that franchise and the magic of that franchise is going to be spread among more and more people. I personally don't care how someone comes to be a fan of The Lord of the Rings or any other franchise that I like. What I care about is that they love it and I love it, and we have common ground. And in sharing our love for the franchise, we can each enrich one another's experience. So, take your gatekeeping nonsense out of here. There's no such thing as a fake fan, unless they were an actor hired to play a fan. Criticism number 2. It's woke. It's woke. Now, I learned a long time ago that anyone who uses the word woke unironically as a criticism of something is just someone who can be ignored. I'm not interested in their opinion. Once the word woke comes out of their mouth, I stop listening to them, and so should you. The reason is that woke is a keyword that appears in the dialogue tree of a very particular way of thinking about the world. It's a thought-terminating cliche, along with its related phrases like SJW, triggered, that kind of shit. Anybody who says that kind of stuff unironically, anyone who says that this franchise has gone woke, therefore it's going to go broke, etc., just stop listening to them, because they don't care about the franchise. And they portray this with every word they speak. Keywords and dog whistles like woke and SJW and soy boy and whatever else are masks to hide a very ugly way of thinking about the world. And that's all I have to say about that. But it does tie into reason number 3. Criticism number 3. It does not #RespectTheLore. Now here's the overlap. A fan of the franchise, or someone who is presenting their criticism as if they are a fan of the franchise, will say something like, there are no black dwarves in Tolkien. It's just not part of the lore. Or, there are no warrior women in Tolkien. It's just not part of the lore. Or something like that. So let's talk about lore and character and all of these other things. Now, all my life, growing up, I've read The Lord of the Rings more times than I've probably read any series of novels, except maybe The Dragon Riders of Pern. And all my life, I've never understood this objection. You know, when I watch an adaptation of a show, if a character has been gender swapped or race swapped, I don't care. I've never cared, and I've never understood why anyone else cares. What I care about is whether the adaptation is good. Does the adaptation tell me a good story that, even if it changes the lore significantly, still feels like it could be part of the world that I love? If that is accomplished, I don't care what the characters look like. I don't care what the actors look like. I don't care about the length of their hair. I don't care whether they have beards. I don't care what they're wearing, etc. If the writing and the acting and the world building and the costuming and the action choreography and all of that comes together to tell a well-paced, engaging story, then I'm happy. If it feels like it belongs in the franchise I love, the more the merrier. Here's a good example from Lord of the Rings. In general, I did not like the Hobbit trilogy of movies. I'm probably not alone in that among Lord of the Rings fandom. But I did like the character of Toriel. She's not from the books. She was put in as a, quote, diversity plant. But in my opinion, she felt like she belonged in that world. So I bought into it. And I enjoyed her journey quite a lot. The movies overall were pretty weak, but I liked Evangeline Lilly's performance, and I thought that character fit in the world. I thought she was a plausible insertion into the world of Tolkien and Middle-earth. So it didn't bother me. I enjoyed watching it. And something similar is happening with this show, The Rings of Power. We've seen a black dwarf. We've seen a dark-skinned, short-haired elf. We've seen Galadriel portrayed as a warrior woman who's much younger or much earlier in her story arc than she was in Lord of the Rings. None of this on its face bothers me. But it does bother a lot of other people, and the excuse they will use is that it's changing Tolkien's lore. And my position is that anyone who has that argument and was not equally outraged by the enormous changes to the lore that Peter Jackson's movies made, then their concern is not really with the lore. The Peter Jackson movies changed a lot. If you haven't read the books, spoilers, but the ending of the Return of the King movie in particular is completely different from the books. They cut out probably a third of the Return of the King, which deals with the spoilers, deals with the scouring of the Shire by Sauron's forces and the recapturing of the Shire. There's a huge set-piece battle that would have been awesome to see on the big screen, but Peter Jackson decided it would ruin the pacing of the trilogy he had made, and so he cut it out and came up with a different ending, and the ending worked. If it had not worked, I would have hated it, obviously, but it did work, and Tolkien fans around the world, for the most part, loved what Peter Jackson did, despite the fact that he made huge changes to the lore. And it wasn't just the ending of The Return of the King. Entire characters and plot lines were removed. Tom Bombadil is nowhere to be seen. Nowhere. Some characters were consolidated. Plot lines were condensed. Timelines were condensed. None of it mattered because the movies were awesome. The same thing could be true of The Rings of Power. The Rings of Power might be garbage, or it might be good. Either way, it won't be because of changes to the lore. I want to say a couple more words about this issue of the lore, because it's pretty wild to me that a lot of fans of Lord of the Rings talk about Tolkien like he was some kind of prophet, like he was Moses or Muhammad or something, and that the books he wrote were delivered onto us as though they are holy writ. They will describe the Lord of the Rings as mythology and speak of it in very reverent tones, and will say that changes to the lore that are being made for the TV show, especially if those changes are woke, should be rejected out of hand because they are dishonoring our cultural heritage and the cultural mythology that Tolkien was trying to build. Now, I'll be frank. Tolkien is a brilliant writer. I think the world owes him an enormous debt. He was a creative genius. The Lord of the Rings is an amazing work of literary fiction, as well as an amazing work of fantasy fiction. But Tolkien was a little too big for his britches. Sure, he had an ambition to create a mythology for the people of England, but that's not what he did, because that's not how mythology works. Mythology is not the result of a singular mind. Homer did not create Greek mythology. Snorri Sturluson and Saxo Grammaticus did not create Norse mythology. They were conveying stories to an audience that had been circulating in their cultures for generations. And those myths and stories changed over time. One of the things that we, with modern eyes, don't really notice about mythology when we look back on it is the fact that we are looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight. We can absorb thousands of years of mythology into one story because we see the whole picture. But people at the time did not. So you could go back to the time of, say, the ancient Greeks, maybe to just after the Trojan War, and find them telling stories about the gods and their heroes that would have sounded totally alien to ancient Greeks of just a few generations later. the kingship of the gods changed, etc., etc. So an ancient Greek from the time of the Trojan War or just after it, and an ancient Greek in, say, the time of Alexander the Great would be telling completely different stories and completely different histories about their shared culture and gods and heroes. Mythology is something that develops over a long period of time in dialogue with the gods and the spirits and the land and the material and political conditions of any given moment in time. So none of that applies to Tolkien. Tolkien wrote a singular story that was the product of a singular point in history. And that's okay. It's an awesome story. But the way so many of these fans treat Tolkien, it just bugs me. I think it's a little weird, honestly. I think it's a very strange way to engage with a text. And in a way, it's very similar to religious fundamentalism, which is something I also have a problem with, but that's for another video. The bottom line here is that lore is not the primary consideration of adapting a written work to a visual medium. And it should not be. The things that should matter are plot, character, acting, costuming, lighting, pacing, etc. If all of those things come together and they can incorporate lore, as much lore as possible, so that it still feels like the world we all love, then I'm happy. And again, I will cite Game of Thrones as a great example of this. For the first 4 seasons or so, that show was awesome, and most of us didn't care that huge characters had been removed from the story. The higher fantasy elements of the story had been stripped out. Entire plot lines were excised, timelines were condensed, and so on. It didn't matter because what we were watching felt like the books. So if the Rings of Power feel like Tolkien, I will be happy, and I think most people will be happy. And lore will take a back seat to that. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Be sure to share this video if you enjoyed it. If you did not like the video, give me a thumbs down. It still counts as engagement, and the algorithm thanks you. And until next time, remember that what is best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.